When we speak of China's hidden strategy, it is essential to understand that this is not a plan written on paper, announced in public, or paraded on the global stage. It is a strategy that breathes in silence, unfolding slowly, while the rest of the world is distracted by noise, arguments, and crises that come and go like waves. For decades, the narrative of global power was dominated by one voice, the West. Nations accepted without question that economic rules, financial systems, and even cultural influence flowed from a single center of authority. But quietly, almost invisibly, China has been weaving a new design, a blueprint for power that does not shout but whispers, a strategy that does not demand attention, yet reshapes everything in its path. This hidden strategy begins with patience. Unlike the short-term thinking that dominates Western politics, where leaders plan only up to the next election cycle, China looks far beyond decades. It thinks in centuries, measuring progress not in months or years, but in generations. This is why much of the world struggles to understand it, because they expect power to rise with dramatic gestures, with loud declarations, with sudden upheavals. But China advances differently. It moves in steps so small they look harmless. It invests in projects that appear ordinary. A road here, a port there, a loan to a struggling nation, a small piece of technology. But when viewed from a distance, these pieces come together like parts of a puzzle. And suddenly the world realizes that the puzzle forms a map of dominance. Look at Africa. For years, Western nations treated Africa as little more than a resource hub, a place to extract minerals and oil, leaving behind instability and debt. China saw something different. It saw opportunity. With quiet determination, it began investing in infrastructure, roads, railways, bridges, schools, hospitals. To the outside world, these seemed like generous gestures, as if China was offering help where others had abandoned responsibility. But hidden within this generosity was a deeper strategy. Each loan, each project came with strings, subtle, invisible, yet unbreakable. Ports that could one day serve as naval bases, roads that connected trade routes back to China, technology systems that created dependency. A continent once controlled by colonial powers, now finding itself tied link by link to Beijing. The same is true in South America, where investments in energy, mining, and telecommunications have increased dramatically. Countries that once looked only to the United States for economic direction are now signing deals with China. And these deals are not just about money. They are about influence. They reshape alliances, shift loyalties, and rewrite the balance of power across entire regions. The West still sees itself as the only source of authority, but the reality on the ground tells a different story. China's hidden strategy also thrives in Asia itself. Take the Belt and Road Initiative, a program that is often misunderstood. To outsiders, it appears to be nothing more than a series of infrastructure projects across countries. But in truth, it is a web carefully spun across continents, binding economies to China's orbit. Each bridge, each port, each rail line is not simply a construction project. It is a node in a vast network. And once connected, these nodes cannot be easily undone. Nations that join find themselves relying on China for trade, technology, and support. Their independence slowly transforms into interdependence and eventually into quiet submission. Technology plays an equally central role in this hidden strategy. While the West debates data privacy, market regulations, and internal rivalries, China builds entire systems of 5G networks, artificial intelligence platforms, surveillance technology, and digital currencies. These are not isolated tools. They are systems of control. Imagine a future where global communication depends on Chinese infrastructure, where financial transactions flow through digital currencies that China oversees, where surveillance systems used in one country are designed, coded, and monitored in Beijing. In such a future, power is no longer held by those who control armies, but by those who control information. And information once captured is the most powerful weapon of all. This strategy is hidden because it does not announce itself as conquest. It does not invade. It does not topple governments with military force. Instead, it uses the one method that is hardest to resist: necessity. Countries in need of loans accept Chinese terms. Nations desperate for technology adopt Chinese systems. Governments seeking development invite Chinese companies. Each decision on its own looks small, but collectively they form an irreversible path toward Chinese influence. It is a strategy of inevitability, one that does not need to be forced, because it is designed to make refusal impossible. Even within the global financial system, this hidden strategy can be seen. For decades, the dollar was untouchable, the backbone of global trade. But China has been creating alternatives, digital yuan networks, agreements to bypass the dollar in bilateral trade, and partnerships that allow countries to trade directly with China without relying on Western banks. At first, these seem minor, but as more nations join, the strength of the dollar weakens, not with an explosion, but with erosion. Like water wearing away stone, the change is gradual but unstoppable. One day, the world may wake up to realize that the dollar is no longer the undisputed center of global finance, and by then, it will be too late to reverse. What makes China's hidden strategy even more powerful is its ability to use openness as a disguise. On the surface, it presents itself as cooperative, peaceful, even generous. It talks of win-win partnerships, mutual growth, and shared futures. But beneath these words lies calculation. Every deal, every investment, every handshake is measured not in goodwill, but in advantage. It is a game of chess, where every move is planned many steps ahead. The West, accustomed to short-term gains, plays checkers. China plays chess, and the difference is not in speed, but in foresight. There is also a cultural element to this hidden strategy. While Western societies emphasize individuality, China emphasizes collective endurance. While Western nations fracture under debates, protests, and internal divisions, China strengthens unity by focusing on a shared long-term goal. This unity allows it to endure sacrifices others cannot. It allows it to think beyond the present, beyond the crisis of the day, and to pursue a vision that stretches into the future. A vision so subtle, so hidden, that by the time others realize its scope, it has already been achieved. China's hidden strategy is not an illusion, nor is it speculation. It is visible to those who know where to look, in the growing influence of Chinese companies across continents, in the silent dependency of governments bound by Chinese loans, in the steady erosion of Western dominance in trade, technology, and finance. The world sees only fragments of this strategy, but when these fragments are placed together, they reveal a picture that is both unmistakable and undeniable. This is why it shocks those who uncover it, because the strategy was never announced, never declared, never broadcasted on global platforms. It was always unfolding in the background, quietly, while the rest of the world argued about distractions. It was always there, hidden not because it was invisible, but because no one wanted to see it clearly. When empires rise and fall, their power is rarely measured by armies alone. It is measured by the money they control, the systems they design, and the invisible chains they wrap around global trade. For decades, the dollar has been the unquestioned ruler of this invisible empire. Nations traded in it, saved in it, and feared being cut off from it. Sanctions became weapons, financial restrictions turned into tools of punishment, and control of the global banking system became as powerful as control of missiles or tanks. But what many fail to see is that this dominance is not eternal. And in the quiet spaces of diplomacy, finance, and trade agreements, a silent currency war has already begun. One that seeks to break the chains of dollar supremacy without ever firing a shot. The foundations of this war can be traced to a single truth. Dependence is vulnerability. When a country relies on another's currency to settle its debts, to trade with its partners, to measure the value of its resources, it surrenders part of its sovereignty. For decades, the United States has used this dependence as leverage. Nations that disobeyed its orders found their banking systems cut off. Leaders who opposed its interests discovered their countries unable to access international markets. It was not an army occupying their capitals. It was financial pressure strangling their economies. The world accepted this, believing there was no alternative. But China saw differently. China saw that the power of the dollar rested not on divine right, but on architecture, on systems, on agreements that could be restructured. And once that realization settled in, the silent war began. Step by step, China began building parallel systems. At first, they seemed insignificant, mere alternatives that posed no real threat. But with each year, these systems grew stronger, and the cracks in the dollar's fortress began to widen. The launch of the digital yuan was one such step. To many observers, it looked like nothing more than a domestic innovation, a way for China to modernize its financial system. But its true purpose was far greater. A digital currency controlled by Beijing, unbound by Western banks, offered the possibility of international trade beyond the dollar's reach. Imagine oil transactions settled not in dollars, but in yuan. Construction projects financed not by Western loans, but by Chinese digital systems. Entire regions transacting without once touching the currency that had defined global trade for 70 years. But the digital yuan is only part of the story. China's silent currency war extends into trade agreements with dozens of nations. Bilateral deals are quietly being signed, allowing countries to bypass the dollar entirely when trading with China. Whether it is Russia, Iran, Brazil, or nations in Africa and Southeast Asia, the message is the same. Trade with us in our currency, not theirs. Each agreement chips away at the dollar's dominance. Each deal is a step away from the old order and a step into a new reality where financial power is no longer monopolized by a single nation. Energy is another battlefield in this silent war. For decades, oil was priced and sold in dollars, giving the currency a near sacred status. But China, the world's largest energy importer, has been reshaping this reality. By negotiating with oil producers to accept yuan instead of dollars, it undermines the very foundation of dollar dominance. Once oil, the lifeblood of modern economies, can be traded outside of the dollar system, the spell of its supremacy begins to break. The world no longer needs to stockpile dollars for survival. Instead, they begin to stockpile yuan, and with that shift, the center of financial gravity moves eastward. Sanctions, once the West's deadliest weapon, are being blunted in this process. For years, the fear of being cut off from the dollar system kept nations compliant. But China's silent currency war offers them escape. by providing alternative systems for trade and finance. It gives sanctioned nations a lifeline. And with every nation that survives outside the dollar's grip, the aura of invincibility fades. What was once an unbreakable weapon becomes a threat that can be bypassed. The silent war does not destroy the dollar in one strike. It erodes it, weakens it, makes it less central, less necessary, and that slow erosion is often more dangerous than sudden collapse, because it goes unnoticed until it is irreversible. This war is not fought with loud declarations, but with patient construction. Payment systems, currency swaps, digital networks, regional banks, all these tools are being quietly assembled. Each on its own may seem small, but together they form an alternative order. Think of it as a parallel highway being built while everyone still drives on the old road. At first, the new highway looks empty, unused, but slowly more and more cars begin to take it. And one day, the old road is no longer the main route. The shift happens gradually, silently, but completely. That is exactly what China is engineering in the world of currency. The West still believes in the inevitability of the dollar. It believes that global trust, history, and habit will preserve its dominance. But trust is fragile. History is not eternal, and habits change when survival demands it. Inflation, debt, and political instability within the United States have already shaken confidence in its financial system. Nations that once saw the dollar as safe now look at its volatility with unease. Add to this the relentless weaponization of the currency, turning the dollar into a tool of punishment rather than partnership, and the incentive to seek alternatives only grows stronger. China's strategy thrives on this discontent, offering nations not ideology, but practicality. Trade freely, avoid sanctions, escape dependency. For many, this is not just attractive, it is irresistible. Consider how this war reshapes alliances. Nations once firmly anchored to Western systems are now exploring alternatives. India, though not fully aligned with China, experiments with local currency trade. Middle Eastern powers, long tied to dollar-based oil sales, begin to accept yuan. Even European voices whisper about reducing dependence on the dollar, fearing that blind loyalty may come at too high a cost. Each shift, each decision is part of the silent battlefield. And on this battlefield, China does not need to win in one sweeping move. It only needs to create enough alternatives that the dollar is no longer unquestioned. Technology, once again, plays a vital role. With blockchain systems, with digital settlements, with new banking networks, China is removing barriers that once kept the dollar supreme. The Western banking system, built on SWIFT, was once a fortress, but now alternatives like CPS, China's cross-border interbank payment system, offer a backdoor, a way for nations to bypass the old fortress entirely. Slowly, more banks join. Slowly, more countries connect. And once they are connected, they no longer fear exclusion from SWIFT because they no longer need it as their only lifeline. The silent currency war is not about sudden collapse or dramatic announcements. It is about creating an alternative reality where the dollar becomes one of many currencies, not the only one, where nations can choose and in choosing weaken the monopoly. It is a war that relies on patience, persistence, and quiet execution. And because it is silent, many dismiss it, believing nothing is happening. But beneath the surface, beneath the noise of daily politics and economic debates, the architecture of global finance is being rewritten. In every age, the tools of power evolve. In one era, it was land, armies, and the raw strength of soldiers clashing on battlefields. In another, it was industrial might, factories producing steel, oil fueling machines, and ships crossing oceans. But today, in the 21st century, the most decisive weapon is no longer a gun, no longer a tank, no longer even a nuclear warhead. The weapon is technology, invisible, intangible, and yet capable of reshaping entire nations. Technology has become the battlefield on which the future is being decided. And within this battlefield, China has positioned itself not as a passive observer, but as an active architect, carefully designing systems that will allow it to dominate without ever firing a traditional shot. To understand how technology has become a weapon, one must first grasp the nature of control in the modern world. Information is the new oil. Data flows are the lifeblood of economies, the pulse of societies, and the nervous system of governments. Whoever controls the platforms, the infrastructure, and the networks controls not just commerce, but also communication, politics, and even culture. Technology is not merely a tool for convenience. It is the framework upon which power now rests. And China, unlike its rivals, recognized this early. While other nations debated the ethical implications of artificial intelligence or worried about regulations slowing innovation, China poured resources, talent, and relentless focus into building technologies that serve both civilian life and state power. Take the example of 5G. To many people, it seemed like nothing more than an upgrade in mobile internet speed, a way to download movies faster or stream videos in higher quality. But beneath that surface, 5G represents control of infrastructure. It determines who builds the pipes through which all future data will flow. When China's companies began exporting 5G networks to dozens of nations, it wasn't simply selling equipment. It was embedding itself into the digital nervous systems of those countries. Every call, every message, every piece of data passing through those systems could be influenced, monitored, or even controlled by the builder of that infrastructure. This is how technology becomes a weapon by appearing harmless on the surface while quietly granting leverage at the core. Artificial intelligence is another arena in this silent war. AI is not just about self-driving cars or chatbots. It is about predictive power, surveillance, decision-making, and even military strategy. Whoever trains the most advanced models gains an advantage in everything from economic forecasting to battlefield dominance. China has built massive data pools, leveraging its population and surveillance systems to collect information at a scale unimaginable in most Western democracies. That data fuels its AI, training algorithms that grow more with each iteration. Facial recognition, voice recognition, predictive policing, all these tools are not just conveniences. They are mechanisms of control. And once perfected domestically, they are exported abroad, sold to governments that crave the ability to monitor and manage their populations. In this way, China's technology spreads like a quiet force, turning surveillance into an export commodity and influence into a byproduct of innovation. Semiconductors, the tiny chips that power everything from smartphones to missiles, form yet another critical front. Control of chips is control of modern life. Without them, economies grind to a halt. Armies are left blind and societies lose their digital heartbeat. China has long been dependent on foreign chip makers, but its hidden strategy has been to rapidly develop domestic capabilities while simultaneously securing access to global supply chains. Billions of dollars flow into research, factories, and partnerships, ensuring that one day China will not only match but possibly surpass its rivals in chip production. The West has recognized this threat, leading to restrictions, sanctions, and bans. But in war, restrictions do not always weaken the opponent. They often make them stronger. Each blockade accelerates China's determination to build independently, to innovate faster, and to create systems immune to external pressure. Technology as a weapon thrives precisely in this space where necessity drives invention and invention transforms into dominance. The role of technology extends beyond infrastructure and hardware into finance itself. Digital currencies, blockchain systems, and payment networks are technological tools that also act as weapons. With the creation of the digital yuan, China is not merely offering convenience to its citizens. It is constructing a financial system that can bypass traditional banks, bypass SWIFT, and bypass the dollar itself. Every transaction becomes traceable, controllable, and governable by the state. This kind of system does not just empower the government domestically. It creates a model that can be exported to other nations. Imagine dozens of countries adopting Chinese-designed digital currency systems. The result is not only economic influence, but also technological dependence, a subtle yet unbreakable form of power. Even space technology plays its part. Satellites, once symbols of exploration, are now instruments of surveillance, communication, and even warfare. China's aggressive expansion into space is not about prestige. It is about creating a strategic advantage. Satellites that can monitor troop movements, disrupt enemy communications, and guide precision weapons turn the heavens into another battlefield. And in this battlefield, China's rapid progress threatens to outpace even long-established powers. Once again, the weapon is not obvious. It does not fire bullets or explode, but it silently determines who sees, who knows, and who controls. Cybersecurity and cyber warfare add yet another layer. In the digital age, wars are no longer fought only with soldiers and bombs. They are fought with code, with hackers, with silent intrusions into networks that control power grids, water supplies, financial systems, and even military command centers. China has invested heavily in building cyber capabilities, ensuring it can defend its own systems while probing and penetrating those of others. These cyber tools can be activated in times of crisis, disabling an enemy's critical infrastructure without a single physical strike. The weapon here is silence, invisibility, and deniability. A blackout, a banking failure, a communications collapse. These can all be orchestrated not with missiles, but with lines of code. Technology as a weapon also shapes the battlefield of influence. Social media platforms, apps, and digital ecosystems become channels of soft power. By exporting platforms used by millions worldwide, China gains not only profits, but also influence over the flow of information. Narratives can be shaped, trends can be manipulated, and perceptions can be altered. A simple algorithm deciding what content people see becomes a lever of control, more subtle and more effective than propaganda campaigns of the past. And as dependence on these platforms grows, so too does the ability to wield them strategically. At the core of this technological weaponization is a philosophy of integration. Unlike in the West, where technology is often developed in the private sector with limited state coordination, China integrates state power and private innovation seamlessly. Companies serve the market, but they also serve the strategic vision of the nation. Their global reach is not just for profit, but for influence, for positioning, for embedding China into the systems that will define the future. This integration ensures that every advance, every innovation is also a weapon in the broader struggle for global dominance. This silent genius of using technology as a weapon lies in its dual nature. To the outside world, it looks like progress, convenience, development, faster networks, smarter devices, cheaper services. Who would resist such benefits? But behind the curtain, These same tools become levers of control, anchors of dependence, and channels of influence. Nations adopt them willingly, even eagerly, not realizing that in doing so, they surrender parts of their sovereignty. And by the time they recognize the cost, the dependency is already too deep to escape. In the history of power, alliances have always been the invisible threads holding empires together. Armies may conquer territory, but it is the loyalty of allies, the networks of trade, and the bonds of shared interest that determine how long dominance lasts. For decades, the West held this network in its grip. Nations turned to Washington, London, or Brussels for guidance, protection, and legitimacy. Global institutions reflected Western values, Western rules, Western systems. But as the 21st century unfolds, these alliances no longer stand as they once did. Quietly, almost imperceptibly, a shift is underway. Nations that once aligned unquestioningly with Western interests now lean eastward toward China, drawn by promises of investment, technology, and security. This is not a sudden break, but a gradual reconfiguration, a rearrangement of the global map that signals the decline of old alliances and the rise of new ones. To understand this shift, one must begin with the Belt and Road Initiative, China's grand project that stretches across continents. What appears to be a series of infrastructure deals is, in reality, a diplomatic revolution. When a nation accepts Chinese financing to build a port, a railway, or an airport, it does not just receive concrete and steel. It enters into a relationship of dependence, a bond that pulls it into China's orbit. The repayment terms, the technology used, the companies involved, all of these ensure that the project ties back to Beijing. Over time, the number of such projects has multiplied, creating a vast network of countries whose economic lifelines are now connected to China. This is not a military alliance, yet it is just as powerful, for economic dependence often dictates political loyalty. Africa is a striking example. Once viewed by the West as a region for extraction and aid, Africa is now being courted by China as a partner. Billions of dollars flow into its infrastructure, healthcare, and education. Chinese companies build roads that connect remote villages, hospitals that treat thousands, and power plants that light up cities. On the surface, this looks like generosity, but in practice, it reshapes political alignment. Leaders who once looked westward for support now turn to China. When votes are cast in the United Nations, when new policies are debated on the international stage, the voices of African nations increasingly reflect their partnership with Beijing. The alliance is not enforced through coercion, but built through gratitude and necessity, both of which bind as tightly as chains. In South America, a similar pattern emerges. Nations weary of Western intervention and restrictions find in China an alternative partner. Chinese investments in energy, agriculture, and mining create opportunities that Western companies either abandoned or approached with conditions. When economies struggle, Chinese loans arrive quickly, without the political lectures that often accompany Western aid. And while these loans carry their own burdens, they also create bonds that cannot be ignored. Governments that rely on Chinese capital inevitably find themselves aligning with Chinese interests. A vote in favor of Beijing here, a silence on its human rights record there. This is how alliances shift quietly, with no need for dramatic declaration. The Middle East, long considered the strategic heart of Western power, is no longer immune to this reorientation. For decades, oil tied the region to the dollar and to Western influence. But China the largest importer of oil in the world, has used that dependence to rewrite relationships by offering to purchase oil in yuan, by investing in ports, and by supplying advanced technology. China has created partnerships that bypass the West entirely. Even nations that once relied heavily on Western military support now see China as an indispensable economic partner. These shifting alliances are not just about trade, they are about trust. And trust, once built, reshapes loyalties in ways no treaty can fully capture. Even Europe, the very heart of Western power, is not untouched. While many European leaders still cling to alliances with the United States, the reality on the ground shows cracks. Chinese companies own stakes in European ports, invest in high-speed rail networks, and supply technology to telecom operators. These ties complicate Europe's relationship with its traditional allies. When pressured to choose sides in conflicts involving China, European leaders often hesitate, aware that economic retaliation from Beijing could cost them dearly. The old unity of the Western alliance weakens, replaced by a more fragmented reality where national interests outweigh collective commitments. What makes these shifting alliances particularly powerful is that they are not built on ideology. During the Cold War, alliances were shaped by competing visions of governance, capitalism versus communism, democracy versus dictatorship. Today, China does not demand ideological conformity. It offers investment, technology, and development, asking in return only for silence on sensitive issues and cooperation in international forums. This makes the alliance more appealing to many nations which prefer practical benefits to ideological battles. It is a form of diplomacy that prioritizes survival and prosperity, and for many countries, that is far more persuasive than promises of freedom or abstract principles. Another layer to this realignment lies in the institutions that once defined global order. The World Bank, the International Monetary Fund, and the United Nations were long seen as pillars of Western influence. But with the creation of new institutions such as the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, China has provided alternatives. Nations no longer have to bow to the conditions of Western institutions. They can turn to Beijing for financing and support. This shift weakens the West's ability to enforce its will through international bodies. As more countries join Chinese-led institutions, the legitimacy of Western institutions erodes. And in the quiet corridors of diplomacy, influence follows funding. Military alliances are not untouched either. While China has not built a network like NATO, it has steadily expanded its defense partnerships. Joint exercises with Russia, arms sales to developing nations, and security cooperation agreements all contribute to a growing web of military ties. These do not replace Western alliances directly, but they provide alternatives, reducing the West's monopoly on security. Nations that once relied exclusively on the United States for weapons or training now diversify, building relationships with China that extend beyond commerce. This diversification dilutes Western power as loyalty becomes divided among multiple partners. The cultural dimension cannot be ignored. Through media, education, and cultural exchange, China is building soft power that complements its economic influence. Scholarships for foreign students, investments in global media outlets, and the spread of Chinese culture through Confucius institutes all serve to deepen ties. Over time, these initiatives create generations of leaders, thinkers, and citizens who view China not as an outsider, but as a partner. Culture, once exported predominantly by the West, now flows from east to west as well, shifting perceptions and loyalties along the way. What makes the shifting of global alliances so significant is its subtlety. Alliances of the past were forged with treaties, speeches, and grand declarations. Today, they are built with loans, trade deals, and infrastructure projects. They are written not on paper, but in dependency, not in promises, but in necessity. And because they develop gradually, they often go unnoticed until their effects are irreversible. Nations that once stood firmly within the Western orbit now straddle two worlds, their loyalties divided, their interests shifting. The result is a slow but undeniable weakening of Western dominance, replaced by a more multipolar world in which China's influence grows stronger each day. For much of modern history, the world was told that certain structures were unshakable. The institutions created in the aftermath of global wars, the financial systems that cemented Western dominance, the political unions that promised stability, all were presented as permanent features of international life. The West built an image of indestructibility, a sense that its rules, its currencies, its military pacts, and its cultural influence would endure indefinitely. Yet beneath the surface, cracks have begun to widen. The old power structures are not collapsing with noise and violence, but with quiet erosion, their foundations weakened by overconfidence, internal divisions, and the rise of alternative systems. What seemed eternal is being exposed as fragile, and the collapse is unfolding before our eyes in slow motion. The first of these crumbling pillars is financial dominance. For decades, the Western banking system, built on the dollar and enforced through institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, functioned as the engine of global order. Nations seeking loans, aid, or trade agreements had no choice but to engage with this system. The West used this leverage not only to maintain economic supremacy, but also to enforce political obedience. Sanctions, restrictions, and financial barriers were weapons disguised as regulations. But the very success of this system planted the seeds of its decline. Overuse of sanctions alienated nations, pushing them to seek alternatives. Debt traps and conditional loans fostered resentment in developing countries. And the rise of new players, most notably China, revealed that reliance on Western banks was not the only path. The collapse here is not visible as a sudden crash, but as a steady shift of capital, trade, and trust away from Western institutions toward new competing structures. Political unions, once hailed as symbols of strength, are also unraveling under pressure. The European Union, designed as a fortress of unity, faces internal fragmentation from economic disparity, immigration challenges, and political disagreements. Instead of presenting a cohesive front, it often appears divided, unable to act decisively on issues ranging from foreign policy to energy crises. NATO, once the unquestioned guarantor of military security, now struggles with disputes among its members and questions about its relevance in a changing world. When alliances begin to argue internally, when members doubt the reliability of collective defense, the foundation of those structures begins to weaken. The collapse of power here is not about external defeat, but internal disintegration, a slow unraveling of trust and coherence. Cultural dominance, another key element of Western power, is no longer as absolute as it once was. For much of the 20th century, Western media, fashion, education, and entertainment shaped the global imagination. American movies, European philosophies, English language universities all served as channels for spreading Western influence. But today, this cultural dominance faces competition. China invests heavily in media networks that broadcast its perspective, across continents. Streaming platforms now feature content produced in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East that rivals Hollywood's reach. Universities in Beijing, Shanghai, and Hong Kong attract students who once would have gone exclusively to London or New York. The monopoly of Western culture has fractured, replaced by a multipolar cultural reality. The collapse here is not total disappearance, but dilution, as Western culture becomes just one of many voices, instead of the single loudest. Military supremacy, long touted as the ultimate guarantor of Western power, also shows signs of strain. The wars of the early 21st century drained resources, eroded public trust, and revealed the limits of even the most powerful armies. While the West still spends vast sums on defense, the effectiveness of that spending is increasingly questioned. Meanwhile, nations like China invest in asymmetrical strategies, cyber capabilities, artificial intelligence-driven warfare, space dominance that bypass traditional military strengths. Aircraft carriers and tanks, symbols of old power, become less relevant in a world where battles are fought with algorithms, satellites, and energy systems. The collapse here is not about losing battles, but about losing relevance, as the tools of old power fail to match the demands of new forms of conflict. The collapse of old power structures is also visible in governance. Democracies, once held up as models for the world, are now paralyzed by division, polarization, and loss of trust. Elections, once celebrated as symbols of legitimacy, now breed suspicion and chaos. Citizens lose faith in institutions, believing them corrupt or incapable of addressing real problems. In contrast, alternative governance models, while criticized for lack of freedoms, project an image of stability and long-term planning. When the old structures can no longer inspire confidence at home, their ability to command respect abroad weakens. The erosion of trust from within becomes as deadly as external attack, slowly hollowing out the authority these structures once commanded. Economically, the old model of globalization is also breaking apart. For decades, the West promoted free trade, open markets, and interconnected supply chains. This system enriched multinational corporations and cemented Western dominance in finance and technology. But crises such as pandemics, wars, and trade disputes have revealed the vulnerabilities of this model. Dependence on fragile supply chains, over-reliance on certain markets, and the weaponization of trade have all undermined the credibility of globalization. Nations now seek self-reliance, building regional blocs and shifting trade patterns toward China and other rising powers. The Western-led economic order, once portrayed as inevitable, now appears fractured and uncertain. Environmental and resource challenges further accelerate this collapse. Old power structures were built on the assumption of endless growth fueled by fossil fuels and unchecked industrialization. Climate change, resource scarcity, and environmental degradation have exposed the unsustainability of this model. Developing nations see hypocrisy in Western demands for green transitions, noting that the West grew rich through practices it now condemns. At the same time, countries like China offer solutions, investment in renewable energy, large-scale infrastructure, and technological innovations that position them as future leaders in sustainability. The Western model, outdated and defensive, struggles to adapt while new powers seize the narrative of progress. The media landscape reveals another fracture. Once dominated by Western outlets that define the global news cycle, the information space is now fragmented. Chinese, Russian, and other state-backed networks reach millions with alternative narratives. Social media platforms amplify voices outside the Western mainstream, often challenging its authority. Disinformation, polarization, and the collapse of trust in traditional media outlets weaken the ability of Western powers to control the global conversation. Old power relied on shaping perception, but when perception fragments into countless competing streams, the authority of the old guardians dissolves. Education and innovation, once the pride of Western dominance, are no longer uncontested. Universities in the United States and Europe still attract talent, but they face growing competition from Asian institutions. Patents, research breakthroughs, and technological advancements increasingly originate outside the traditional centers of power. China's rapid advances in fields such as artificial intelligence, biotechnology, and quantum computing signal a redistribution of intellectual dominance. The collapse here is not about the disappearance of Western innovation, but about its loss of exclusivity. What was once a monopoly of ideas is now a competitive marketplace where Western voices must compete rather than command. Perhaps the most profound sign of collapse lies in perception. Power is not only about armies, wealth, or influence. It is about belief. For decades, the world believed in the inevitability of Western dominance, the permanence of its institutions, the superiority of its systems. That belief created compliance, loyalty, and even admiration. But today, that aura has dimmed. Nations question Western reliability. Citizens doubt Western values, and rivals exploit Western weaknesses. When the myth of permanence is broken, the structures built upon it lose their force. The collapse, therefore, is not a single event, but an ongoing unraveling. A steady realization that what was once considered indestructible is in fact vulnerable and fading. Warnings are often dismissed, not because they lack truth, but because they arrive before people are ready to hear them. History is full of examples where empires, leaders, and societies were cautioned about dangers ahead, only to ignore them until it was too late. The unseen warning is not the absence of evidence. It is the inability or refusal to recognize the signs that are already there. In the present age, such a warning is unfolding in silence. It is not written in headlines or declared in speeches. It exists in the subtle shifts of trade, the quiet agreements between nations, the erosion of trust in old institutions, and the slow, deliberate rise of a power that does not shout its intentions, but allows the world to walk blindly into its embrace. This warning is unseen, not because it is hidden, but because most prefer not to see it. The unseen warning begins with complacency. For decades, the West assumed that its dominance was permanent. The belief that its systems, its values, and its financial structures would stand forever created a blindness to change. Leaders spoke confidently of rules-based orders, of eternal alliances, of the inevitability of progress flowing from their centers of power. But in that confidence lay the seed of downfall. Complacency makes threats invisible until they are undeniable. The unseen warning is that power is shifting, not through war or invasion, but through 1,000 small decisions made every day in capitals, boardrooms, and marketplaces across the globe. Each decision taken on its own looks minor. Taken together, they signal a transformation so vast that by the time it is acknowledged, it may already be irreversible. Another layer of this unseen warning lies in the very tools of power. Technology, finance, and trade networks are no longer neutral instruments. They are weapons wielded with precision and foresight by those who understand their potential. Nations that believed their dominance in these areas was unassailable now find themselves challenged at every turn. Payment systems bypass the old financial order. Digital currencies undermine the supremacy of the dollar. 5G networks and artificial intelligence systems embed influence deep within the infrastructure of other countries. Each of these is a warning in itself, a signal that the tools once monopolized are no longer exclusive. But because the changes are gradual, because they do not explode dramatically on the world stage, they remain unseen to those unwilling to connect the dots. The unseen warning is also written in alliances. When nations, once firmly within the Western orbit, begin to look elsewhere for investment, security, and influence, it signals a realignment. But the assumption that these alliances will remain intact blinds many to the shift. When African nations vote alongside China in international forums, when Middle Eastern states consider yuan payments for oil, when South American countries sign trade agreements that bypass the dollar, these are not isolated incidents. They are strands of a larger tapestry, one that reveals the unraveling of old bonds and the weaving of new ones. Yet the warning remains unseen because it is more comfortable to believe in permanence than to accept change. Domestic divisions amplify the blindness. In many Western nations, politics has become fragmented, polarized, and short-sighted. Leaders focus on winning the next election rather than planning for the next century. This short-termism creates vulnerability because rivals who plan decades ahead exploit the lack of vision. The unseen warning here is that internal weakness is as dangerous as external threat. Nations that cannot unify behind long-term strategies are ill-prepared to confront the slow but steady advance of a rival with patience and cohesion. The distraction of domestic turmoil blinds societies to the external shifts that are reshaping the global landscape. The media plays its part in obscuring this warning. Headlines chase immediate crises, dramatic stories, and political scandals, while the deeper structural changes receive little attention. The erosion of the dollar's dominance is not a single event, but a process spanning years, yet it rarely captures the urgency of a breaking news cycle. The rise of Chinese technological dominance is incremental, built through patents, research, and investment, none of which provide the spectacle of military conflict or political upheaval. And so the warning goes unseen, not because it is absent, but because the mechanisms of attention in modern societies are ill-suited to recognizing long-term transformation. The unseen warning also emerges from the very success of the rival strategy. By presenting itself as cooperative, peaceful, and mutually beneficial, China disguises its intentions behind the language of partnership. Nations eager for investment, technology, or infrastructure accept deals without fully considering the long-term consequences. The warning is unseen because it does not come wrapped in hostility. Instead, it comes in the form of opportunity. But opportunity that creates dependence is not generosity. It is strategy. By the time this realization surfaces, the dependency is already too deep to reverse. Another dimension of the unseen warning lies in the shifting psychology of nations. Power is not just about resources or technology. It is about belief. For decades, nations believed in the invincibility of Western systems, the reliability of Western alliances, and the inevitability of Western leadership. That belief created compliance, even submission. But as cracks appear, belief fades. And when belief collapses, so too does the legitimacy of the structures built upon it. The unseen warning is not only about China's rise, but also about the West's loss of credibility. When nations begin to doubt, when they begin to seek alternatives, the power that once required no enforcement begins to vanish. The unseen warning is visible in the erosion of trust in Western values. Democracy, long presented as the superior model of governance, faces crises of legitimacy as polarization, corruption, and inefficiency dominate headlines. Economic systems that once promised prosperity now appear to generate inequality and instability. International leadership that once projected confidence now appears fractured and uncertain. These internal failures become global lessons, teaching other nations that the old models may not be as reliable as once believed. China does not need to convince the world of its superiority. It only needs the West to reveal its weakness. The warning is unseen because it comes from within, from the slow collapse of trust in the very values that once defined dominance. Geopolitical events add urgency to this unseen warning. Every sanction that drives nations to seek alternatives, every war that exposes the limits of Western power, every crisis that reveals dependence on fragile supply chains becomes a piece of evidence. Yet these events are often explained away as temporary setbacks rather than recognized as signs of structural decline. This blindness allows the process to continue unchecked. Rivals expand their influence not because they are stronger, but because others fail to recognize their own weakening position. At the heart of the unseen warning is the danger of silence. Unlike past threats, which declared themselves loudly through military buildups or ideological confrontations, this one advances quietly. It does not seek open conflict. It does not demand immediate response. It thrives on going unnoticed, on being underestimated, on being ignored. The greatest danger of an unseen warning is not that it is invisible, but that by the time it becomes visible, it may already be too late to act.